The beginning of my childhood was very like nuclear family, like very
Okay.
traditional American family. Like my mom, my dad, my sister, all living in one house. Because
Okay.
my parents were really good at kind of keeping the bad things away from us. So when I was 13 years old, my dad committed suicide. Once I found that out, it was almost like everything else that was being kept from us started to like come out and everything like that.
Yeah.
So I kind of went from being very, very sheltered to being very exposed to a lot of things very
Yeah.
early.
You sat down here. We've only had a brief discussion before. So everything you just shared was new information to me. See, I could have easily looked at you and prejudged you and thought, oh, her life was probably pretty good compared to mine, right?
Yeah.
And then you just freely shared all this information. It's like quite the contrary.
So I would say the beginning of my childhood was very like nuclear family, like very
Okay.
traditional American family. Like my mom, my dad, my sister, all living in one house. I have 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother.
Okay.
But my 2 oldest siblings are significant age difference. They're 13 and 15 years older than me, so they
Oh,
were in
wow.
and out of the house growing up.
Um,
And then I would say about when I was 15 years old, or not 15, 13 years old, I'm sorry, is when things kind of started to like change because
Okay.
my parents were really good at kind of keeping the bad things away from us. So when I was 13 years old, my dad committed suicide.
oh, wow. I'm so
Yeah.
sorry to hear that.
No, it's okay. But once I found that out, it was almost like everything else that was being kept from us started to like come out and everything like that.
Yeah.
So once I found that out, my sister moved back in with us. And my
Okay.
sister and my mom always kind of had issues like fighting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
My oldest sister, she moved back in to help us out. But she also was always kind of like the type to kind of party and stuff like that, whatever. So when my dad passed away, she got onto heroin. And so that was kind of around. And then her and my mom started fighting really bad, like
Yeah.
physical and verbally. And then my sister got kicked out and she started being a prostitute for money.
To support her habit.
Yeah, to support her habits.
Yeah.
So I kind of went from being very, very sheltered to being very exposed to a lot of things very
Yeah.
early. And there's obviously a lot more of that kind of went on, but I would say growing up past that, I kind of had to, have you ever heard of like the archetypes of like different children of trauma? I would say like I kind of was like the hero archetype where I felt like I had to take care of everything, which was interesting because I was the youngest.
Yeah.
But I definitely had to step up a lot. I had to step up and like kind of take care of my sister and like watch over her. And also because my other sister, she was like a straight A student up to that point, and she started like failing all of her classes. So once that happened, all of my mom's attention was on to my other siblings, and I was like the youngest. So I started like helping around the house a lot more. Like I was like very like OCD about like everything having to be perfect, like for my mom and like how she like things to be, because I didn't want there to be more conflict. I was very aware of like what was going on in the room. So then when I got into high school, or there was a period for like a year and a half where my mom had a boyfriend after that, and there was never anyone around, so I was like home alone a lot. And so that was kind of, and then I transitioned from that to being in like kind of like a full house situation where my sister moved back home, and actually 2 of my cousins started living with me too.
Wow.
And my sister and her boyfriend were living with me. And then because my sister ended up moving back, and then she overdosed and she had a brain injury where her memory started to reset. Like at first it was very quickly, like every like 5-10 minutes, but then like she rebuilt it. So then she was kind of like someone who needed a caregiver for a while. And then not too long after that, when she started to get back on her feet a little bit, she got pregnant. So then it was a lot of like everyone helping and taking care of the baby and doing all of those kind of things. So I would say my childhood was a lot of being very concerned about my family and like trying to help support my mom. Like I was always the one to help with big projects around the house,
Yeah.
or house sit, dog sit, babysit. I actually ended up switching to online school my junior year so I could babysit my nephew while my sister was at work and while my mom was at work.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, first of all, I want everybody to take a deep breath on that one, because I wasn't expecting you to say all that. I really appreciate you by sharing all of that, because that's heavy.
Yeah.
For any one person. Let me just try to backtrack for a second to make sure I caught everything that you said. So you said that initially you had, we could say for the most part, a picturesque childhood, as far as you could tell from your vantage point, right?
Yes.
Then the first sort of leg that dropped was your father committed suicide.
Yeah, well, my parents kind of announced that they were getting a divorce, I think like 9 months before that.
Oh, okay. So that might have been sort of the inception point that set your dad down a path that maybe
It was his, he was the one who initiated the divorce.
Oh, okay. Okay. So there was that level of stability that was getting rocked from the family side in the home. Dad initiates the divorce. He makes that decision. So then he's no longer there. That obviously for any family would be devastating.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're missing half of the person who helps like create the stability for the home. And then after that, it seems like that's when a lot of the other dominoes started to fall. Because you're saying, okay, now my mom's going through this, my older sister and my other sister are starting to have their own instability. One's getting on drugs, the other one's not doing as well academically, which is all totally understandable and reasonable. Even the drugs. Let me make that point. It's understandable why people use drugs. It's not because they necessarily want to deal with all the negative consequences and side effects. It's because a lot of times they're dealing with so much hurt and they don't really have appropriate coping to know how to deal with it. And again, we're talking about your father. Like, that's not just somebody, right? That would impact any one person. I lost my mom when I was 7 years old, but it was to brain cancer. So not quite as drastic. Loss is loss, but it does matter the context of how it happened, right?
Yeah.
So I'm a little more maybe at peace with how it went down, maybe than perhaps you or your family was able to maybe at that time.
Yeah, there was actually a lot of drama with it because coincidentally enough, my dad, in his letters, they were basically all blaming my mom for it. And that a lot of our other family stopped talking to us. Like even on my mom's side, they stopped talking to her because he had it so that they were sent out to everybody and everything like that.
Okay, so he wrote notes upon his departure and he had them mailed out to family?
Yes, family and friends. So now everyone in my mother's life had this perspective of her. And I'll say that I was never really influenced by that. When I actually, when they first got the option to read the letters, it was my dad's family. Actually, my uncle was the one who found him on my dad's side. And he went and made a copy of it, and so they were gonna give us a copy, and then because I was so young, they were gonna have one of my siblings read it to me, and I wasn't gonna be able to read it myself.
Oh wow.
And also my dad's side of the family kind of went through and took everything they wanted from his apartment, so I was very I was just really mad about that, and
Sure.
kind of just I was also very I kind of dissociated and just didn't want to deal with any of that, so I actually didn't end up reading them until I was 18 years old. But from what I knew, which I heard a lot because I had a lot of people saying things to me about it, obviously, but I never actually blamed my mom. I know some of my siblings would say stuff like that and throw in her face, but I feel yes, my mom can be a lot, and I'm aware of that, and I've had my own issues with her, but that's any mother-child relationship. But there's not one person or one thing that can make you do something like that. That's a personal choice.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's and I appreciate you saying that. I think that's what takes a lot of nuance to be able to even come to a place of peace where you can even understand it in that way. Because it's easy when somebody lays blame, especially when they're no longer here, and just feel well, that was their final word, so that must be true. Versus you maybe have more of that lived experience with her, and you're hey, I'm not saying she's a perfect person, but I don't think that all of these things that may have been said about her are ultimately what led to my father making this decision, because he still was accountable for his own decisions, right?
Yeah, well, also, I feel like it's up to the individual to put themselves in a position that gives them the most possibility for happiness and success.
Agreed.
And if who you're with or who you're around isn't doing that for you, like, you have to make those decisions for yourself.
I agree. I will acknowledge for those that have children, because I do have a child. I know it is difficult sometimes when there's children involved, because there's a hesitation to want to make that step, because you're thinking about, I'm ripping their stability away. But to your point, which I actually agree, you got to think about what you're demonstrating through your actions and your behavior to your child. So if I'm miserable every day, if we're married and we have kids and they're watching us and we're screaming at each other, sniping at each other, hot and cold with each other, they're observing all of that. And you better believe they're thinking, whether they know it intentionally or not, they're incorporating that into their psyche. So when they go out and start forming relationships, they believe that that is normal, healthy behavior.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, I only saw my parents get in one actually bad argument. Like, they'd bicker here and there, but nothing that really stuck out to me to the point where I can't even remember it. But the biggest thing about my parents' dynamic is my mom, she was very in love with my father, but he was very distant from her. He was a very present dad. He was very into having children. He was very into our school and our sports and just being there and cooking and everything like that. But I remember one time they started like kissing each other on the lips, like high and by again, and I was like, what is this? Because I was like not used to seeing that
like,
at
this is different.
all. They were just like not intimate with each other. So in that sense, as I got older too, I started to feel for my mother in ways where she did kind of start presenting herself in ways that weren't the best. But thinking about yourself, like, if I was in a relationship where I wasn't getting that kind of affection back and all of my needs with intimacy and everything like that was like unmet, I would start kind of losing it too. Like, I wouldn't be super happy, or I'd probably sit there to my partner and just be like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Because, like, how could you not feel like that, especially when this is the man you're in love with and the man you have kids with?
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, especially when you take to that step and you actually get married. I mean, I would think, of course, you're thinking, this is my person, so all the effort that I'm going to put in is, of course, to maintain the level of relationship that we have. Now, I always try to make the point, it does vary over time, number one, from dating to marriage, then when you live together, and then when you incorporate children, and they had multiple. So the more children you have, obviously, the harder it is to maintain that. It's not impossible, but you have to understand it's going to take significantly more effort, because what I notice is parents tend to lose that identity of themselves, and they focus more on either being the parent and or the parent and and their marriage, but they lose the sense of self. So if like a woman, it could be like, I forget what it's like for me to be an independent woman outside of my relationship. Not to mean that you behave in an independent way where you don't care about your family, but there's things that you used to do that satisfied you that you forgot to do because now you're focused on being a mom. Now you're focused on being a wife. And we have to satisfy all aspects of who we are to generally be more fulfilled, so you can sustain the length of that relationship and that marriage, until one of us is no longer here, ideally. And so I could definitely appreciate where you're coming from in terms of mom feeling like maybe I'm going to have to withdraw more because I'm not getting that level of attention that I was getting from my spouse. But I want to circle back to what you were saying, because there's a lot of traumatic experiences that you outlined like very quickly, right? How do you feel like you've been able to navigate that as you've gotten older? Because that's a lot for anybody to deal with at a young age. And then you kind of outlined, if I'm understanding correctly, that it happened throughout your childhood. It wasn't like it just happened once and then that was it, which would already have been a lot. But how have you navigated that as it's progressed throughout your childhood and getting to where you are now?
So I'm very grateful that my family's at a really good place right now for us. It's not perfect, but we're good for us right now. But I would say at first, I think when I was 14 years old, I started doing things kind of for attention, because like I said before, I wasn't really getting attention. And that didn't work.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it didn't work. It kind of was just, like, I got caught doing a lot of stuff when I was like 14 that I just should not have been doing. My best friend at the time, her and her mom like came over and like sat down in front of my mom. And my mom had like a therapist walk in on me, like in our living room with my sister, and they were like, I know you're doing like X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh my God. So then after that, all it did was make me a little bit more grumpy and more like, I never want to have to go through that again. So then I just got better at like keeping secrets, but my acting out in a way kind of like pulled back. I kind of chilled out on being a little.
Yeah.
And then as I started to get older and got more responsibilities, and also my sister and my mom, they are just two people who should not like live under the same roof whatsoever, like my oldest sister.
Okay.
So now they're doing that, and they're helping and they're working together to basically be the primary caregivers of a child, which, if you know anything about how grandparents and mother interactions are when they disagree about things, it
can be very difficult.
Yeah,
to say the least.
And my mom is very much the type to be like, oh, you should do it like that. Like, she just voices her opinions even when you don't really ask for them.
Unsolicited.
Yeah, so they just know how to make each other mad. So for a while, as I got older, like, it would kind of, like, vary, like, the levels of conflict. But a lot of the time, like, there was a period where I, like, would start hearing yelling when it wasn't happening. Or I'd have to deal with, like, a lot of, like, just me having to do interventions, like having to go buy a drug test from like CVS for my mom to like do this like big intervention, and I'm like, well, I'm gonna go in my room for this because I don't want her to be mad at me. And also I'm very similar to my mom in like a lot of ways, good and bad ways, but working on the bad ways. But because of that, ever since I was 13, everybody was just like, oh, you're just like your mom, but like as an insult, you know, that's how they meant it.
Yeah.
So because of that, all of my siblings like kind of excluded me from things and always assumed like, oh, you're on her side, when like I would be trying to play neutral.
Yeah.
So I kind of got painted out to be this person I wasn't. Like from 13 years old, they would be, like, I would like walk into a room and they'd be like whispering, and then like as I walked in, they'd disperse and like stop talking about it, and kind of got like excluded from things. And also there was always this idea that like, oh, Amanda's like very privileged and she's like very babied and she gets whatever she wants, which for me, I never really saw it like that, and it didn't feel like that, which like made me frustrated.
Yeah.
Because for me, it felt like I had to like keep everything together, and it got to a point where I felt like I had to be as perfect as possible because I didn't want to be more of a burden for my mother or for anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So with them kind of like having this one vision of me, like it definitely did make me feel kind of very alone in like my house. That's why when my cousins moved in, it helped me a lot, because like they were like, I had one cousin who was a year younger than me and one who was a year older, and
right in the middle.
Exactly. And they ended up being like my best friends in high school, and they helped me cope with it a lot. I would say it was once I started to kind of like get away from them, is that I started to see my trauma manifest in ways that weren't so pretty for a while. I think when I was 17, I was suffering with like depression really badly, but in the sense that I would put myself in dangerous situations because I just got to a point where I was like, I don't care what happens. Or I think I wanted something to happen, but I didn't want to do something like what my dad did. So I would just put myself in like the most ridiculous, like how do you get yourself in that situation at 17 situation, like things ever.
Okay. So classic risky behaviors that you were engaging in. Part of it you said might have been attention seeking, which I think is understandable. But even again with everything going on, so you were the youngest out of that bunch of your siblings, right? What I think is interesting, I'm the youngest, I only have an older sister, but for me, I think about when you're missing a parent. So you and I have this in common. There's an inherent impact in how it plays in your life. I think for each parent, this is my experience, you may not agree, that I'll just speak from my perspective. So me not having my mother there's a sense of warmth and empathy and compassion that women tend to bring to family dynamics. Not to say fathers don't do it, but it's just more predominantly traits that women do. And fathers tend to be more the disciplinarians, the structured individuals, things of that nature. So I had an abundance of that, but I was missing that other side. My sister did try to supplement it as best as she could, but my sister is 4.5 years older than me. So naturally, there's only so much she can do because we were both really young. I say all that because I imagine for you and for your family, not having your father there, there's aspects and elements of him not being present anymore that negatively impacted not only your mother and your siblings, but in particular you, especially since you were the youngest. Have you thought about what some of those effects might have been, or some of those situations that maybe you found yourself in that might have been boiled down to the fact that dad is not here?
I would say that my dad was, like I said, he was very present. He was a very like good father. He was very into whatever. But my mom was very like laissez-faire about parenting. She had a very casual outlook on it.
Yeah.
So I went from having my grades checked every week and getting rides to soccer practice and just, you know, being watched and paid attention to I'd have to like bring my mom my report cards, and she never knew what classes I was taking or help me pick them out. I stopped doing soccer because she didn't want to drive me to all the practices, and if you know anything about sports, you can't really be on the team if you can only go to half of them.
Correct. You gotta go.
And I stopped asking her for rides because it was always an issue when I did, so I started like biking around or like finding rides from other people.
Wait, can I pause you there real quick? It sounds like with your father not being there, the immediate impact you're outlining there is there was a greater sense of independence that you might have had to take on, because dad was willing to kind of help you still be a kid, being monitored, providing that support of transport, things like that, to now you're saying, oh, well, I had to avoid my mom in that way. So I try to figure out how can I do it on my own. When you were how old?
13.
Okay, please continue.
So I kind of became very, very like hyper independent, and my mom also isn't a very like nurturing or emotional person. She's just not like that, I think, because of how she was raised. So I never had that like, oh, like it's gonna be okay, oh, I know it's hard. Like she was always just like, oh, like you have a great life, like you should be grateful. Or kind of just not the type to like not believe in like depression or like not believe in any of that. She was also she also never really pushed me. She was always like, if I got straight A's, she'd be like, oh, it's okay to get a B. Or she would be, or when I want to get a job, she was like, you don't need to get a job right now, which I think part of that was so I could be home more. But or when I started taking dual enrollment classes, so I started taking college classes like full-time schedule when I was 16. And when I started doing that, it was, oh, that's too much. Why would you do that? Or like, it's like everything I did, she was always just like, it was never like a good job. Every time I was upset, it was never like, oh, it's going to be okay. Like, talk to me about it.
Soothe you.
No, none of that. So I got very good at self-soothing and kind of taking care of myself.
Okay. So now you're going back. So that goes back to the idea of you being hyper independent. And again, you said that started at 13, correct?
I think it, like, my mom tried to keep up what my dad had going on for a bit. Yeah. But I don't think she was able to in the long term.
See, what I would be thinking about is that being such a critical age. That's like essentially the beginning of prepubescence and adolescence, right? There's a lot of things going on, even if we just talk about from a biological standpoint, right? That you want to be having discussions, moms with girls, fathers with boys. So you're not having that. And what you just said, which I appreciate, is actually contrary to what I was just saying a moment ago, that women typically are providing the warmth, the empathy, the compassion. You're saying my mom was not like that. So are you saying that your father was providing more of that from what you can recall?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So it's interesting. So that means you and I do have more in common, just opposite gender with the parents, because you're saying that you didn't get that opportunity to be open and maybe share, and you weren't invited to do as such. So then you learn to just do without. In terms of getting it from them, you're like, okay, I have to find a way to make this happen for me.
Yes. I think for a while I just didn't. Like I would repress a lot of what I felt. And I genuinely think there was a long time where I didn't understand how I felt about like anything, and I also didn't understand that my life wasn't like normal.
Of course. And that I appreciate you saying that, because I think the vast majority of us, we got to keep in mind, for those that don't know, your lived experience is normal to you, but it doesn't mean it's normal to everybody, right? The only way actually we figure this out is by us actually conversing and figuring out, like, oh, somebody, this is a perfect example, right? You sat down here. We've only had a brief discussion before. So everything you just shared was new information to me. See, I could have easily looked at you and prejudged you and thought, oh, her life was probably pretty good compared to mine, right?
Yeah.
And then you just freely shared all this information. And it's like quite the contrary. So part of this is us understanding the details of what people go through. And number one, people are not how you might perceive them immediately. That's why you want to take time to get to know them. But also, what I feel like we're getting to is the impact of loss, particularly when it comes to parents and children. And you're outlining that the person that you lost was the person who would have given you that space for you to be able to be open and to share. I think that that's vital. Because I can tell you, I'll speak from a man's perspective, and from my perspective being raised by my father, most men I know, they don't do that. I don't think it's because they hate emotions. I don't think it's because that they are so uncomfortable that they would rather not. I think it's that they just never had the opportunity to properly learn. And unfortunately, a lot of parents don't do the work that they need to do to learn how to do differently when it's their turn with their kids.